In our last study, we entered into lesson number 18, and we have 10 questions. If you have lesson 18 that has 19 questions, throw it in the trash. It's not supposed to be there. I thought I'd caught all of them. That's from earlier chapters, like back in Acts 14. I know some filled out the questions anyway, so I commend you for that. You at least went to find answers from the Bible, but there's only 10 questions in this one. And so if you don't have a lesson 18, I know we're out of them right now. They're online. I think the corrected copy's online. I hope it is, because that's what my plans were. But I added those questions and didn't even think about it. So I apologize for that. On our lesson 18, we have our first question of how was Paul received by Christians in Jerusalem. So we're in the 21st chapter, and now he's made his way to Jerusalem, months of travel. And we know from Romans the 15th chapter that he wanted the brethren to pray that they would be receiving them with their gift, their offering of benevolence for the Christians in Judea and in the area of Judea, in that area where they were suffering. So Gentile churches, about Corinth, Macedonia, Achaia, all those have been involved in giving this contribution, and Paul and his companions are now in Jerusalem to deliver it. So this is why it's a good question. How was Paul received by the Christians in Jerusalem? It did gladly. That's exactly right. And that becomes what's important. I think that's a good sign. They were glad to receive him. They were glad in the sense that probably here was help that indeed was needed. And it's a wonderful reception that he has. And it's short-lived as he's in Jerusalem. But there again, it says that the brethren received us gladly. He was worried about that and wanted people to pray about it. So what was God's will in that prayer? They're going to accept that. Our second question deals with James, which every time we study the book of James, or we hear about James, and in Galatians, James the apostle, and we realize, notice he's distinguished from the apostles here. When the day following Paul, in verse 18, went with us unto James, and all the elders were present. There might be, all of them, including James, were there, but it seemed to be a distinction. He's distinguished in Galatians as an apostle, but he was the Lord's brother. He wasn't one of the 12 apostles. So I think here the idea, he's not one of the 12. He's an apostle and the brother of the Lord. He's not one of the elders. I'm saying he's distinguished, but he's an apostle. And some commentators, he's a secondary apostle. Barnabas was an apostle. And all the apostle, the word means one sent, a messenger with the authority of God behind them. And James, the Lord's brother, had that kind of influence in the church in Jerusalem. Just go to Acts 15 when they're having a conference. He's one of the leaders. He's one of the ones that speak up. So he's a messenger with the authority of God, but he's not one of the 12. And I think he becomes one who is indeed the Lord's brother. He's one of the brothers. And at one time, they did not believe on Jesus. But after his what? They did. His resurrection. What a sign. Where here, and you just look at Jesus' life, he's always put down when he goes back to his hometown. Familiarity breeds contempt. It doesn't mean he's something special. We know him. We know his mother. We know his brothers, his sisters. He's God. He's sent from heaven. It was hard for them to grasp that. But what the defining point, like Romans 1:4, speaks about the fact he was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. And did Jesus promise it? 3 days, what will happen? I'll be raised. If I said that, you'd say, poor fellow. Or down south, bless his little heart. And that's you're crazy to do that. Well, the point is, this has been the plan of God, and he had indeed fulfilled that. And the word declared means it's the horizon. There's that distinct horizon that just stands out. And his brothers were at least honest enough to admit that indeed, hey, we rejected him, but now we're going to receive him. And James is one of those leaders. So we have apostles. There's more than one James in the Bible, but I think that becomes the point. So I think he writes the book of James, the Lord's brother. He's a leader among the elders, in the sense that elders, but he's one as an apostle, and kind of standing out like Barnabas stands out, and fulfilling that word apostle as a messenger without being one of the 12. But when Jesus' resurrection was done, he didn't go to all the people, but he went to the eyewitnesses of him. So they were established as eyewitness testimonies of those things. So I think that's the James we're talking about. He's a brother of the Lord. He's a leader in the city, in the church of Jerusalem, and that becomes important. All right. Any comments? All right. Questions? Paul spoke in general terms concerning his ministry among the Gentiles. Just general terms. It was a good trip. It's good things. What does the Bible say about what he said about his ministry? I think it was detailed. It's one by one. And when he had saluted them, he rehearsed one by one the things which God had wrought among the Gentiles. There were specific things that he wanted to talk to them about. It wasn't just generalities and the Lord was blessed, or we were blessed by the Lord. He did some specificity in his report, which he could talk about the fact that Gentiles now are open to the salvation just like we Jews were. And we've already had Acts 15 take place, where that is confirmed. And James is here, where he's one of the leaders there. And so he tells them about the Gentiles being saved. And of course, James was on board with that as well. So one by one, I think, shows a distinctive thing. So it wasn't just general terms. There are specific things that happen. And do you like specificity when you're thinking about someone's trip? Maybe not. You don't want to see all the pictures? This is you might not want that, but we're talking about salvation of souls and how Gentiles received it, especially when you're in a population where there are a lot of Jews, and that became a problem in Acts 15 with the influence that they might have. But I think we'd like to hear the specifics, like Joe Price over there this weekend in San Antonio. He's spending a whole class period to tell about his trip. He'll do things one by one. Yes, sir? Yeah.
What's going on, and that's what we want to see.
Yeah.
When we see a letter from them, we don't want them to just be gentle.
Yeah.
We want some specificity.
I think so too, David. Okay. What two specific points have been made to Jewish Christians concerning Paul's teaching? We'll kind of go along in the text. So what did you see there about his teaching? So they glorified God, and they said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands there are. See, well, let's talk about. I'm ahead of myself. He reserved one thing that brought him on the Gentiles through his ministry. So in his ministry, what had happened? They believed. Thou seest, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of them that believe. So there's that part of it. So what do we see here as any specific points about that? And I think I have the wrong point about the sixth point in Paul's teaching. Were they true? That leaves it.
They accused him of denying Moses' law.
Yes.
Encourage him not to circumcise.
And then the other part, and you touched on it. They're not circumcising their children, but also they don't follow my Bible says the customs of the Jews. And that becomes, is that something that it was not found in the Old Testament and just through a cultural change and it became a tradition? And that, is he talking about that? And we're going to find some areas where we can answer that. But notice it's interesting that it's the idea of the law of Moses, because he didn't circumcise their children. And you just think back that when Paul argues in Romans the 4th chapter about that salvation is by faith and not by works, you talk about the circumcision. When was Abraham justified by faith? Before the law? Or was it after the law, which just stayed, well, circumcision was the issue? See, Abraham was to be circumcised before the law. That's a powerful point to make. It wasn't the law of Moses. It codified it in a sense, but it started with Abraham, where indeed he's going to circumcise Isaac. He circumcises him, he has himself circumcised. And idea that there's a sign of God's people. So that was his argument. It wasn't the law of Moses when it started. It starts with Abraham, but it wasn't based upon, therefore it wasn't based upon a circumcision, because in Acts 15, before circumcision, Acts 17 happens, is when he's justified by faith. Believing in the fact that he will have a multitude of his lineage. So follow that of time frame and how powerful the argument is that indeed before the law and for those things, even when Abraham hadn't been circumcised yet, he was justified by faith. And that's how we are today. So those two points, and the one about we're going to have to wrestle with this one, because we have things in order, and got Paul arguing about the law, and writes the Galatians already been written. He's writing about the law, and it's not the covenant's not anything about the law of Moses, and yet we see this idea of the customs among the people, that indeed they believe you don't preach. Those are contrary things. You contradict the idea of law of Moses with circumcision, and you also teach against the customs that we might have. So he says, the Jews in verse 20 who are Christians, they are all zealous for the law. Well, they shouldn't be. You turn away from the law of Moses. Not in this context. And James and the elders are leading them. So there are many thousands there are among the Jews and of them that have believed. Now, was their belief genuine? I think we'll have to assume it is. You don't have to go there. They were genuine Christians, but they were zealous for the law. And you think they were circumcising their kids? Yeah, I do. That was a problem. Now we're circumcised our children. Gentiles have to. They had to deal with that among the Jews. Elders didn't send them. James didn't send them. That was contrary to reality. But indeed, that had been their custom. That had been a culture. And you say, well, rightly so, because we're not under that law. The law says circumcision or non-circumcision, it's indifferent to God. That's what a Christian has to put their hand around. So they might say, well, it's not, but we're doing that. And the law of Christ talks about you can have that. We're not going to that's not going to be a divisive line, and yet it was very much a dividing line among whose God's people were. So there's quite a change. But notice how James, as he's kind of the head one here among the elders, he's the one that's mentioned. There are many thousands there among the Jews of them that have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. They have a zeal for the law, and that's not a negative thing necessarily, unless we want to go there. And they have been informed concerning thee, that thou teachest all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after their customs. You have to circumcise your children. That's a lie. You circumcision you can, circumcision you don't, but it's not going to make you justified before God. He said, what is it therefore? They will certainly hear that thou art come. So he's received gladly by the Jews. But there's another problem. Because he's preaching the gospel. He's preaching a new covenant. He's distinguishing the law of Moses. And you're not justified by the works of the law. And he's out there showing, well, we don't follow the law. And so this is the accusations, which I think circumcision is just not true. People accuse people of things, but we need to have the context. So we're trying to develop the context with Paul on his side and what he does. So here's what the elders said. They said, what is it therefore? They will certainly hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men that have a what? They have a vow on them. So we're now not dealing with something that was just out here. We can apply this and see, do we see that in the law of Moses? Well, just a law in general. It's a specific practice that they have. They have a vow upon them. And he said, we have 4 men. He said, these take and purify thyself with them, and be it charges for them, that they may shave their heads, and all shall know that there is no truth in the things whereof they've been informed concerning thee, but thou thyself walkest orderly, keeping the law. Paul said, don't talk about the law to me. He didn't say that. And what are his actions? What does he do? He does exactly what they wanted him to do. And was he a compromiser? Was he one that it becomes a very difficult thing to work out? And we know that he's not a compromiser. And so we have to wrestle with the fact of what is this this law. So do you find anything very familiar with a vow, taking of a vow, the shaving the head? We saw it back when Aquila and Priscilla, some say, well, that was Paul that shaved his head. He had a vow on him as they're going to Ephesus. But that's kind of a similar to what we're seeing here. And we talked about that being a Nazirite vow. And one of the things that hits us that we see Nazirite vow in number 6, and we see that connected, well, that's Samson. He was going to be separated from birth. He's not going to drink wine. He can't partake of grapes of the vine and all of its connections. And we look at that as being a lifetime commitment, which was upon Samson with his family at birth. And one of the part there was not to cut his hair. And we're shaving the hair here after 7 days. And there's purification involved. And we ask the question, what could have happened? So if you just start with number 6 and realize they could have touched a dead body. And today, I haven't been able to deal with the news, but Mr. Lieberman fell and died today. Say you had a vow of God separate you as the Jews did, and you touched him. You would be unclean. You would have violated that law, and you need a burnt offering and a sin offering. Turtle doves were involved. There would be a 7-day purification. On that 7th day, you would bring the burnt offering and the sin offering to the priest, and he would offer it on your behalf, so you can now enter into relationship in the temple and so forth, and be established. It's ceremonial cleansing. It was part of the law. It's a Nazirite vow. And so if this is what is happening here, which seems to be what was happening with Ephesus, and Paul going there, and I think Aquila had shaved his head. That's what would happen. When it comes down to the time of when you've had this purification for 7 days, then you would shave your head and you'd be cleansed, because that was, you did wrong, you touched a dead body, and or any other thing that would make you unclean under the law, especially with the vow. Vows were important. Vows were essential to be kept, and you didn't keep it. Therefore, this was the remedy for that. Well, here are 4 men. Do you think they're Jews or Gentiles? I think they're Jews among the believers, and they have made a vow, and apparently some reason, we're not told, is that they have violated that vow. And so they're in this process. So what was to happen? Who was to be a charge for them? David?
It's American standard. I think King James also more modern version say pay their expenses.
Yeah, he's the charge. Oh, pay their expenses for what? Sacrifices. And that were to be offered. So indeed, Paul is going to be the one who does that, and he follows through. He has to purify himself, so he hasn't had a vow on him. He hasn't. He didn't have to wait 7 days to be purified, but he purifies himself. You could be, if you had become unclean, whatever, you touch something, a dead body carcass or something like that, or other things, you would be unclean for a day. He could be purified and go into the temple and be a charge for these 4 men. So he's very much involved in the practice. He's a charge. He purifies himself. He goes into the temple to indeed talk about it's time for them to be cleansed. And of course, they can't go in there. He stands in for them, and then the priest receives the money to have the sacrifices, offer the sacrifices, and then they're cleansed. And this is what the elders and James said to do, and Paul did it. So I don't think Paul's a compromiser. I don't think he talks out 2 sides of his mouth, just trying to get along with them. He stood up against the apostles in Acts 15. If they were going to go that route, he has truth. He's inspired of God. Now, to justify, you're offering an animal sacrifice, Paul, on behalf of this. That goes against our law, because we know animal sacrifices don't forgive sin. Jesus does. And that's very true. But this was a kind of a cleanness, and we call it ceremonial cleanliness, and being cleansed from impurity, not necessarily the sin that we've talked about, but it was the sin. And you look at number 6, that was so you could be sanctified before God. And of course, Samson from birth, these other people, I want to be sanctified before God. Well, isn't that what happens when we're cleansed by the blood of Christ? We're sanctified. So a lot of close connection there. So some have argued, some commentators have argued, and they said, well, he hadn't learned yet all the truth. God was just revealing truth a little bit at a time. And Paul was very definitely speaking about the distinction of justification between the law and them, but he hadn't dealt with this issue that way. God just hadn't told him yet about that. And therefore, he was just revealing what he knew. He's practicing what he knew. He's going to know more about it later. That's one way of people looking at it. Or it could be, and this is where I am, though there's issues about the sacrifice. A lot of times, offerings, our praise to God is an offering. Our praise to God is an offering. Hebrews 13. Our doing good is an offering. It doesn't have to be a blood sacrifice for forgiveness of sins. Those are offerings that we're setting forth before God in praise, doing good, and helping those in need. Hebrews 13 speaks about those are offerings unto God. And yet, that doesn't take away that indeed there were turtle doves, and there was the burnt offering, the sin offering. All those things are part of their regiment for purification. And there's the cleansing of the ashes of a red heifer. Jesus, he takes away our sins. That's kind of the flesh, and this is a ceremonial thing, kind of the flesh. That indeed those sacrifices were connected with that, And we found that's been the custom of the Jews. And apparently, Paul, James, elders, standing for the truth, distinctiveness of what sacrifice Jesus is, and the law of Moses, they will talk about the law of Moses in terms where it said we're not going to be a part of that. But it's the idea of justification by faith. But a lot of things, there were customs of the Jews in place. That's why, hey, I got to get home for Pentecost. I got to get home for one of the feasts. Paul's been acting in that regard. Was that so he could just get with the crowd? He comes, and there's those customs of the Jews set in their culture, as he says in 1 Corinthians 9. 1 Corinthians 9, I came to all things to all men as a Jew. I came as a Jew. And there's things he could participate in without violating the law of God concerning justification by faith through Christ. But that becomes you're walking a fine line. You're having to split, and people don't like to do that. It's not just, well, because they did offer burnt offerings, and he's there in charge of paying for them, participating in that regard. You can't ignore that. And then Luke just leaves that for us. We don't know other than that was done. You're walking orderly. You're keeping the law, keeping the customs of the people. You're zealous for the law, customs of the people. Circumcision was one. And did Paul circumcise Timothy? He didn't circumcise Titus, but he did it in order to get along with the Jews, because there were Jews in the area where he did that. But see, we're no circumcision is it's kind of like eating meats, and we can eat meats or not eat meats, and those things are indifferent to God. They once were not indifferent with God, but they are now. And I think maybe the Nazarite vow, or taking vows, that's serious. And so we're going to comply with what made that vow for God, and we'll be a part of that, knowing they don't take the sacrifice of animals, doesn't take away sin. But that ceremonial cleansing was a part of it as well. So they said, do this so they will know that they don't teach the truth about you. And he did it. And he did one for every one of them, declaring the fulfillment of days of purification until the offering was offered for every one of them. So there was 4 men, 4 offerings implied there. And so when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews in Asia, they saw him in the temple. Why? He's a charge for them. He is now purified. It's now coming to an end where they will come and shore their heads and offer their sacrifices, and it'll fulfill their vow unto them. So we just pick up as if these things were done, and Paul didn't contradict himself, didn't contradict the truth of the gospel about that, but he's complying with the customs of the Jews where he could, without violating his conscience or violating the law of God. Any questions or comments you want to add to that? Or you have another angle. Did he sin? Could you say he sinned? I can't. There's nothing indicating that he did. Otherwise, why don't we say, I'll just go to the bars. That's where I'm going to do my ministry. And I'll do all things to all men. And I'll just go and advocate things that are sinful. Holding a vow, and these were what they lived under. Now, let's see what happens here. How does the lie spread that we're looking at when we see about those 4 men? And we talked about he's in charges for all of them. David brought that out of being one who pays for their I'm saying the sacrifices, but he was there. How could Paul be consistent with his teaching that one sacrifice would be part of the offerings in verse 26? I've given my view. Anybody want to add something before we go? Yes, David.
The same thing I wrote about the way Paul had Timothy circumcised. So,
Yeah.
I was totally in agreement with him.
But he didn't say that's part of salvation, did he? Or did he check? I think it's good. How the Jews from Asia stir up the multitude in Jerusalem. If you want to stir up a crowd, you can do a lot of things to do that, can't you? We've seen it before, and like Demetrius. So what happens here in Jerusalem? They received us gladly. He's trying to show that he's not against the custom of the Jews while he preaches a distinction between justification by faith and works of the law. He's not going to hide that. So what was the story about Paul that was being spread around? Yeah, he took Gentiles in the temple, which is a no-no, right? Now remember, you got the court of the Gentiles in the temple area, and you got the court of the Jews that a Gentile was not allowed in. That's where the temple was. That's where sacrifices were offered. And so Gentiles had their place. But when he said, we saw him bring, and he talks about, what is it, Trophimus? For they had before seen with him in the city Trophimus, the Ephesian. Well, yeah, because we're here bringing money. We're bringing contributions and also traveling companions with them. Probably a Greek. And whom they suppose that Paul had brought him into the temple. 4 men, Jews, they would be in the temple. A Gentile could be in the court without being in the temple area. But what they say, we saw him in the city, and we knew he was here, and he's going to be charges for people. They may see that. We assume that's why he brought a Gentile in the holy place of the temple. And what happened? A riot uproar. And I just want to get to a picture. They come and drag Paul. Am I terminology right? Drag Paul out of that. Shut the door of the temple. It's unclean. Paul. And they take him, and they were trying to do what to him? Kill him. And they're beating him when the officers come and say, stop. That's what Paul, that's what a lie went through to do. And they got them all about. And then when the authorities said, well, what's all this about? They didn't know what. Some of them didn't know exactly what has happened. But that's what stirred it up. And to the point that they come and get Paul and are striving to kill him. This is the second time that we observe that the Roman government, those in charge, have saved Paul from Jews killing him. That we've seen that. Corinth was one. Gallio stopped it. So if you've got a problem with the law, see it to it, but you're not going to do that here under its rule. And now we see those who are indeed in charge here, they're able to save Paul, and they do that. So how, you want to ask, well, how did the Jews stir it up? They just put two and two together in their mind, and it connect the dots, how I want you to do it. And they got the people in uproar over that. Approximately how many Roman soldiers are on the hand to save Paul? And we get this by looking at knowing the Roman setup with their soldiers. And here was a cohort. There's idea of military tribunes. Some translations have that. But that kind of gives us an idea. Notice the band, as they were seeking to kill him, tidings came to the chief captain of the band, or the cohort. That probably didn't help us too much. When you look at that, that's 1,000 men. We know there was multiple other leaders in this band. And what do we know them? We know them. We're pretty familiar with them. What are they? Centurions. Tells you a centurion is over how many? 1,000 cohort. Band of soldiers. And they're there to uphold law. And you have centurions that are over 100. We know that from Scripture as well. And so the chief captain came near and laid hold of him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and inquired who he was and what he had done. He didn't know Paul from whatever. He didn't know what he had done. But what does a lawman do? We're going to have to do something. What is it? Let's stabilize the situation. So would he think we had a bad situation? How many chains did it take? He got 2, didn't he? 2 chains to be involved in changing him, whether that's feet and hands and that sort of thing. I don't know, but that's why I've got to find out. So some shouted one thing, some shouted another among the crowd. And when he could not know the certainty for the uproar, he commanded them to be brought into the what? Now, my Bible says castle. Some have barracks. Here's a garrison. And what we know in the city of Jerusalem, there was the castle of Antonio that was there. That would be the barracks. We get an idea of the barracks. That's where these soldiers were. And they're there inside Jerusalem. They're to keep the order. And Jews had to live with that. But they were there. And they're coming to the aid of Paul. So we're showing what government is in place can be a benefit. It saved his life. And that was important. So there was about 1,000 of these. And so here comes the curiosity of the chief captain. We asked, what did the chief captain first think Paul might be? Thank you. An Egyptian. And did he influence a lot of folks? He led them out in the wilderness with all the assassins. Insurrection. We're going to overcome what? Here's a Roman officer. Who is he? Well, he was an Egyptian. Let's overcome the Roman law. Let's overcome the Roman government in Jerusalem. He would know about that. Josephus writes about an Egyptian. The total amount is different. 30,000 instead of, what does the Bible say here? 4,000. And so that part is a discrepancy. But indeed, there was that type of insurrection. So what did the apostles think when Jesus was resurrected and being with them? Do you establish the kingdom yet? And what were they thinking about? What kind of kingdom were they thinking about? Overthrow Rome. Overthrow the Roman government. Free us. We need to be free from this Roman. They got their soldiers here, and there was a difficult. What in our country? We had the English here. We have in our our laws, our Constitution, and our rights. We don't have to house the army. You can't force it on us, because that was being forced, and you can create that type of anger. So that's what we're looking at here, and he's trying to learn about it. He thought that. So what is Paul? What is Paul when he talks about being Egyptian? But Paul said, I am a Jew. And he says, where is he from? And when Tarsus is mentioned, what does he say about it? It's like Philadelphia, a city of love, right? It's no mean city. What do you mean by mean city? Small, insignificant. It's very significant. I'm from a pretty important city, and I am a Jew. And here the Jews want to kill you? But he's stating the truth. He said, I am a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech you, give me leave to speak unto the people. And when he had given him leave, Paul, standing on the stairs, beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake of them in the Hebrew language. So the officer said, do you speak Greek? Because I'd like to speak to you, Paul said. May I? He was being very respectful. May I speak to you? Well, you know Greek? I think there's an Egyptian. He said, no, I'm a Jew. Where'd they come from? He's born in Tarsus. And indeed, he was a citizen. Are you a citizen of America? Yes. But we're citizens. What's more important? We're a heavenly kingdom. Yet we serve as good stewards and good citizens of the city we live in, as long as we're able to follow God. So that's the end of lesson 18. The rest of you, just forgive me. I gave you work that you didn't have to do. And you probably said, I can't find those answers. But you'll find them from earlier lessons, and I should have noted that, but I didn't. I had to get it out. Okay, any other comments you might have or addition? Okay, thank you for being here and participating.